Hi, it's the 1492 guy coming to you live on International Women's Day. All the best to you on International Women's Day. Now, where did Women's Day start? Where did women's rights emanate? Where did they start from? The answer is they started right here in the Great Lakes area, the same place that the first metallurgists in the entire world came from, who were making copper fish hooks thousands and thousands of years ago and trading them around North America. Now, the 1492 guy talks about how Indians and Europeans were peers and co-equals in 1492, but then everybody forgot. History forgot, and we forgot, and all people forgot. So where did women's rights come from? Well, the answer is they came from right here around the Great Lakes. So we'll get into that. Well, why do we celebrate Women's Day? I mean, that's half the population of the earth, pretty much, except maybe in China, but it's half the population. When we have Dentist Day, we have Plumber's Day, where there's small fractions of the population. Why do we have a day celebrating half the population? Well, it's because of the way women have been treated all down through history and almost everywhere in the world. That their position today versus where they were in the past is a cause for celebration in itself. The position of the women over time has not really been an enviable one. But many people are not understanding the struggle. They don't realize the history and what went on, the background story of this. The early suffragettes had a lot to do with the influence of the way things are today with women. Now, England had voting of women just before World War I. The United States was just after World War I. Did you know there's places in Europe that only got the women's vote in the 1990s? One country, and it was a 51% vote. Switzerland only had women voting in the 1970s, and that was another 52% vote. So this struggle of the early suffragettes, Matilda Gage, Lucretia Mott, Susan Anthony, Lucy Stone, Elizabeth Stanton, they knew the Iroquois women very well. And many of the northern Indians as well had matrilineal societies where the women had rights that would be the envy of 21st century women. And the Iroquois Confederacy, which is a political system that goes back over 800 years, and the women basically ran that political system. It was a matriarchal society. The heritage was passed down through the woman's side. They were considered, in a sense, to be landowners. They gave birth to people, so they were, in effect, considered to be the ones that would give birth from Mother Earth, and were in charge of that. Remember, 75% of our world's foods were gifts to the world from the American Indian in the Western Hemisphere. 30% of the world's landmass, 75% of the world's foods, grown and developed over many years, and not growing out in the wild by any means, but grown and developed on Indian farms, and in a lot of cases by women on those farms. So the early suffragettes, they knew the Iroquois very well, just as Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. These people knew the Iroquois and their system very well. The Iroquois, who had pestered them, in a sense, to get their 13 separate administrations together into one, because the Iroquois were very organized so that they could deal with them properly. And the U.S. Constitution, as is now being admitted for 70 years, was imprinted on the Iroquois Constitution, which has been around for over 800 years and is still in use today. The women essentially ran that political system, and all of the kings and queens in white man's land, Europe, which was 100% dictatorships, they were afraid of that system, and rightfully so, because it did eventually spread to the Americas. Women ran that political system. They nominated. It was really the world's first democracy. And so where did they get their ideas from? They got their ideas from the Iroquois women, those early suffragettes. It's well known and well documented how they knew these Iroquois women, and that's where their ideas came from, as they had conventions traveling across the Atlantic back and forth, and eventually did the vote just before World War I. And Matilda Gage, for example, said the political system under Iroquois women reached the highest state known to the world. So they were very complimentary. The colonial authorities, they looked past the women when they came. 400 or 500 years ago. It was a clash of civilizations, and the men completely ran that society. In Europe at that time was still legalized wife beating and legalized marital rape, and chattel or ownership of women was still around as well too. So the men in the colonial authority situation just didn't get it. They tried to strictly deal with the men, but that's not the way a lot of the indigenous cultures operated. So people will say you can't compare the standards of today and go back in time and fairly compare, because things were different. There was cultures, there was different ways of doing things. And so to look back and see how women were treated 500 years ago, well, the indigenous women were equal in their society 500 years ago. To say, well, the 40s and 50s Hollywood, it was a different culture. You can't expect it to apply today's standards and retroactively go back, extrapolate today's viewpoint on the past. And that's been a pretty standard type of reasoning. But then I thought, well, how come? Why not? What about the golden rule? Isn't that a thing? The golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Wasn't the golden rule around 500 years ago and also 50 years ago? It's not going to change whether it's 5,000 years ago or 5,000 years from now. So I say, let's go out of our way. Let's apply the standards to people 500 years ago, to Hollywood. What about to slavery? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. We remember that when we remember, by the way, that in the Iroquois Confederacy, slavery was outlawed and had been over 800 years ago. It has been for hundreds and hundreds of years, and they refused to participate in the slave trade and chasing runaway slaves, which was a huge business. So let's remember that when we look at the 60 million to 70 million dead Africans between 1500 and 1800. What about the golden rule? Also, by the way, they gave us the first democracy, and this also applies to women. Because what are we taught? What are we taught about democracy? Everything good and great had to come from Europe, right? We're taught that Greece had a democracy. Well, that was 60 to 70% slaves, and the women were owned. They were chattel, they were property. The old people had no say, children had no say. And what about children? Women have a particular affinity, even more so than men, related to women because they bear the children. What about children's rights? And in the Iroquois Confederacy, where the children had a say at the age of reason, 14, 15 years old, and that is a real democracy, when everyone has a say. And any country with slavery or where everyone doesn't have a say is not a real democracy. So the children have a right. So not only that, the children are 50% women as well too, aren't they? So anyway, let's all celebrate Women's Day today and how far everything's come, but also let's remember a little bit about 1492 and the way things stood and what the influence and who gave us women's rights that have spread around the world today. All right, 1492 guys, signing off. We'll talk again soon, and bye for now.